Actually, I had brought the house key with me, but I still chose to knock on the door. It's been half an hour since I saw Franklin Maurice bringing his companion upstairs from below. According to his routine, he should have already showered and rolled into bed by now, reaching a crucial moment. If he were interrupted forcefully, he would likely be very angry. Franklin Maurice rarely gets angry. The last time he did was when I brought up divorce. The divorce agreement I drafted with sincere effort was torn to shreds by him and scattered all over the floor. I really didn't understand what he was angry about, Franklin Maurice. I believe I'm quite self-aware. The house, the car, and the savings are mostly yours, so I haven't taken any of them. What exactly are you still dissatisfied with? Let's discuss it. Discuss my ass. Franklin Maurice comes from a scholarly family and runs a cultural media company. He's always been very refined and elegant, although he has a lot of hidden malice. He knows how to maintain an image. No one would fail to praise him as a gentleman when he's out. But now, hearing him curse so openly, with his thick eyebrows furrowed and the corners of his eyes reddened, his jaw muscles prominently bulging, it was clear he was very angry. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, his hands on his hips as he paced back and forth, suddenly turning to glare at me, making my legs feel a bit weak. Damn, even when he's angry, he's so handsome. As someone who's attracted to looks, I guess it's not a complete loss to fall for him. After all, I slept with him for 3 years, and his skills were quite good. What are you thinking with those wandering eyes? Franklin Maurice's sharp voice snapped me out of my reverie. When I looked at him again, without any filters, he was just my clueless ex-husband. I'm thinking that if you provoke me again, I'll go out and tell people you're useless. He took 2 steps towards me, squinting his eyes. Why don't you want anything? Hey. The house, the car, the money, why don't you want any of it? Why should I want them? They're all yours. You can keep them for your new wife. How great is that? Damn new wife. I don't agree to the divorce. I couldn't help but laugh. Franklin Maurice, you can't have it both ways. You don't love me, and there are plenty of admirers outside. I'm even taking the initiative to step aside. Can't we just part on good terms? Do you love me? Franklin Maurice suddenly asked. Because he was so close, I could even hear the resonance in his throat and chest when he spoke. He had never used the word love before. Even now, questioning me, it still struck me as infuriatingly mesmerizing. Then came the sudden burst of anger. How could he demand love from me when he didn't love me himself? To know it would be hard and still choose to divorce, and not want anything. Isn't it just to completely cut off all ties between us? What or who has made you so eager? Franklin Maurice's analysis only made him angrier, gripping my hand unconsciously tight. I am most afraid of pain, so I got even angrier, pushing him away forcefully. If you don't sign, it doesn't matter. I'll move out. As long as we've been separated long enough, I can file for divorce in court. After saying this, I turned around, planning to pack my things in the bedroom. Suddenly, I was lifted from behind. Franklin Maurice had a serious expression, his eyes strange. That depends on whether you have the ability. He threw me onto the bed in the bedroom and quickly covered me, his hands much stronger than usual, his kisses fierce as if he wanted to devour me, from my cheek to my lips, from my neck to my collarbone. Franklin Maurice lingered on me with his eyes closed, murmuring words that, for some reason, had a hint of devotion. I felt like a fish thrown into boiling water, struggling helplessly, my heart ached with a mix of anger and grievance, and I scratched his bare back hard, only to have him pin my hands and kiss them. Little wildcat, always clawing. Franklin Maurice is always so hard to discern, and I can never see through him. There were many moments like this that made me think he might love me before I could even feel happy about it. In the next moment, he would cruelly mock my infatuation. He always maintained control effortlessly, while I remained the most passive prisoner. That night, Franklin Maurice held me for a long time. Exhausted, I felt dizzy and didn't mention divorce again. He probably did it on purpose. At the moment, who is sleeping in my bed with him? Are they more beautiful than me? Or do they love him more? I gave a bitter smile, having to admit that part of the reason I chose to knock on the door was that I was afraid of seeing something that would break my heart if I just walked in. Let's preserve the last bit of dignity for both of us, not for him, but for myself. The door opened after just a few knocks. Franklin Maurice was neatly dressed, wearing reading glasses, and holding a stack of documents, looking very serious. "What are you doing?" I sighed in relief and felt guilty for my dirty thoughts. I cleared my throat. "What do you mean? What am I doing? Can't I come back to my own house? You still know this is your house. You have the key but still knock on the door. You're a real hassle." Seeing me glancing inside, Franklin Maurice suddenly laughed lightly and leaned towards my ear. "If you catch someone cheating in the future, remember to call my mom. She's more experienced. My mother-in-law, Mrs. Sean Wilcox, is indeed an extraordinary woman." At 17, she saw a watercolor painting by my father-in-law, Tim Frank, at an art exhibition and was awestruck. She desperately tried to find a way to meet the artist. Initially, she just wanted to express her admiration, but she ended up falling in love with the handsome and elegant Tim Frank at first sight. At that time, Tim Frank was 32 and already married. Despite her disappointment, she couldn't let go and tried to persuade Tim Frank to take her as his apprentice, just to be closer to him. At first, she had no malicious intent and was very earnest in her studies. Tim Frank praised her a few times, which made her very happy, and she respected his wife as well. However, when she discovered that Tim Frank's marriage was unhappy, her feelings, which she had been trying to hide out of moral considerations, started to resurface. Tim Frank's wife was his first love, but could never forget her own first love. Tim Frank's character was somewhat rigid and boring, and the couple had no children after marriage, making their already shallow feelings even harder to maintain. Eventually, Tim Frank's wife reconnected with her widowed first love, leading to a passionate affair and prompting her to ask Tim Frank for a divorce. Tim Frank was deeply in love, reluctant to end things despite being cheated on, but the resentment was too much to swallow. He fell into despair and quickly lost weight, his once charming demeanor disappearing. One would think Sean Wilcox's affection would diminish, but women are the most unpredictable beings. It's one thing to like a man, but if you develop a deep affection, you're bound to fall. Tim Frank's despondency and vulnerability only made Sean Wilcox's heart ache even more. She confessed her feelings to Tim Frank, expressing her love with sincerity and intensity. It was a deep love that included but was not limited to admiration, infatuation, loyalty, and desire. Sean Wilcox admitted she took advantage of the situation, but she felt it might be her only chance. Tim Frank had no reaction initially, just staring at Sean Wilcox for a long time. Perhaps he had long sensed her feelings, but it touched him more at that moment. In the end, Tim Frank divorced his wife and married Sean Wilcox half a month later, quickly enough to make one wonder if he was afraid she would change her mind. Sean Wilcox was not unaware. She just loved Tim Frank so much that she was willing to be a moth to the flame, even at the cost of severing ties with her parents. At that time, she felt there could be nothing more wonderful than having Tim Frank, and she was willing to give all her passion and patience, without any regrets. Unfortunately, reality often defies expectations. Even though Sean Wilcox loved Tim Frank, he remained attached to his ex-wife, or rather, to the humiliation she brought him. He began to cheat frequently, entangling himself with various women, married or single, mature or young. Not all of these affairs led to physical relationships, nor were they solely out of loneliness. If anything, it seemed more like a form of revenge. However, the pain from these selfish and immature actions had to be endured by Sean Wilcox. She cried, fought, begged, and even confronted him at hotels with their young son. Every time, Tim Frank acted heartbroken, but continued his affairs, seemingly unable to stop. After multiple attempts, Sean Wilcox eventually became desperate and, in the long-standing humiliation and frustration, developed a kind of obsessive hatred. She would never divorce Tim Frank, nor would she allow him to be free and happily promiscuous. The position of wife she had fought for, she would hold on to until death, even if it meant a mere shell of a marriage, only to continue tormenting each other for the rest of their lives. Thus, Sean Wilcox began a more than 10-year-long career of catching Tim Frank cheating, gathering enough dirt on him to potentially destroy his reputation and position in the art world. Yet she kept it all hidden, not only to torment Tim Frank, but also to protect her son's reputation and career. Franklin Maurice inherited Tim Frank's artistic talent, and was deeply influenced by it. from a young age. He has made notable achievements in calligraphy and painting, with a vision to spread culture and create commercial value, surpassing his father's endeavors. Despite his own excellence, Franklin Maurice couldn't avoid being labeled as Tim Frank's son. Their fates were intertwined, ensuring mutual destruction. Franklin Maurice didn't seem to care much about this and often encouraged his mother to divorce or at least to confront the situation openly. Initially, I thought he wanted his mother to be free, but later he admitted it was because he found accompanying her to catch Tim Frank cheating too troublesome. Yes, out of empathy, Franklin Maurice was almost entirely compliant with Sean Wilcox, agreeing to marry me, a woman he didn't love. As for his father, he harbored little resentment. Instead of hatred or understanding, he was closer to a kind of numb disdain, even less significant than a stranger. In summary, all three of them are peculiar. I was indeed careless, and a single misstep landed me in this predicament, which now seems impossible to escape from easily. Franklin Maurice has always refused to divorce, which I find puzzling, and I can only attribute it to inheriting my mother-in-law's stubbornness. But I believe I've never wronged him. If I must say, perhaps it's because I couldn't give him a child. Thinking of this, a familiar pain surged in my chest, like a sharp drill boring into my flesh, making it harder to breathe. I instinctively lifted my hand to cover my heart, then gently placed it on my lower abdomen. There was once a child there, my child with Franklin Maurice, who we ultimately couldn't keep, and I may never have another chance in this lifetime. I looked up at the young woman standing next to Franklin Maurice, attentively recording work arrangements. She was beautiful, dressed in a professional commuting dress, exuding an air of competence and impressive charm. In comparison, I seemed somewhat inadequate. Even when I once occupied the same position, I never had such a presence. After my miscarriage 6 months ago, Franklin Maurice forbade me from returning to work, so someone else had taken over my assistant duties. And what about the wife? Is there someone else replacing that role as well? The female secretary was either intentionally or unintentionally leaning on Franklin Maurice's arm, unsure if this was her usual intimacy or a deliberate display in front of me. It doesn't matter. There will always be someone else. Interestingly, Franklin Maurice noticeably moved away, his brow slightly furrowing. The secretary probably didn't realize this was a sign of his impatience. She glanced up at me a couple of times, her deep eyes filtered through transparent lenses, showing a hint of anticipation, which gradually faded into disappointment after I met her gaze calmly. I was briefly moved. Was he actually waiting for me to question him? Or was he just waiting to criticize the female secretary for her ill intentions? Then I remembered the light laugh he gave when he opened the door earlier. It wasn't irritation at being suspected, but rather a certain excitement that seemed to hit the mark. Was he expecting me to throw a tantrum and cry, so he could give a righteous explanation, and we could perform an 8 o'clock marriage drama together? I shook my head. Franklin Maurice was indeed a strange fellow, who couldn't be understood with normal reasoning. Thinking back to when I first met him, he was just like this. That must have been one of Sean Wilcox's attempts to catch him cheating. The other party couldn't have been an easy target. Even though she won, she was severely drained, hiding in the bathroom and crying, tossing her dazzling diamond ring onto the sink as if it were worthless. As I passed by and saw her crying so pitifully, I handed her a tissue and offered some symbolic comfort. She then grabbed my arm and insisted on giving me the diamond ring as a token of thanks. This is for you. As a thank you for the tissue. Was she out of her mind from crying? I didn't dare accept it, and quickly refused before rushing out, accidentally bumping into Franklin Maurice, who was waiting outside. Sean Wilcox yelled after me, "Catch her!" Franklin Maurice, who probably thought I was his father's mistress, had no regard for tenderness. He roughly twisted my arms behind my back and pressed my face against the wall. The pain made me gasp. And there was something even more important. Please let go. The wall is too dirty. Franklin Maurice behind me seemed momentarily stunned, loosening his grip briefly before Sean Wilcox caught up and pulled him away. What are you doing? How can you be so rough with a woman? Do you have no sense of decorum? Is this how I taught you? Franklin Maurice looked innocent. Wasn't it you who told me to catch her? Besides, you usually tear apart little girls in one go. I was terrified, afraid that I had fallen into a mother-son crime ring involved in abducting and killing young women. I didn't even bother to wipe my face, and intended to escape. The next moment, a soft, smooth handkerchief was pressed against my face. Gently wiping it, I looked up and saw Franklin Morris's empty suit pocket, neatly folded shirt collar, and handsome jawline, finally resting on his cold but focused eyes. Seemingly, cleaning my face was the most important thing to him right now. My heart fluttered, and my fingers instinctively curled up. Franklin Maurice applied less pressure but still wiped my face painfully, though I forgot to pull away. All done, Franklin Maurice quickly finished, retracting his hand and handing me the handkerchief along with Sean Wilcox's diamond ring. I naturally refused, but he insisted, "Take it. Out of the three of us here, you might be the only one who finds a bit of joy from this ring, so it has some meaning." I could see that both he and Sean Wilcox were wealthy, but I didn't understand how anyone could be unhappy despite having wealth and diamonds. It was only much later that I learned for Sean Wilcox, the ring was a symbol of disgrace and shackles, while for Franklin Maurice, it represented an unfortunate childhood he couldn't escape, endless arguments, unbearable scenes, parents driven mad to the point of losing their sanity, nauseating false affections. Everything seemed like a massive tentacle, pulling him into an unfathomable darkness. Franklin Maurice acknowledged desire but did not believe in love and was even less willing to enter marriage. However, if it could boost his personal image and company stock price, he could reluctantly accept it. This was the most useful reason Sean Wilcox gave to persuade Franklin Maurice to marry me, and it was also the one that disappointed me the most. Many times, I felt powerless. Clearly, I had an outstanding figure and appearance, excellent education and abilities. How could it be that none of it made me worthy in Franklin Maurice's eyes? Yet I fell for him at first sight. So under Sean Wilcox's strong matchmaking efforts, I gave up my ideal career to become Franklin Maurice's assistant. Even when Sean Wilcox suggested we marry, knowing that Franklin Maurice had no real love for me, I impulsively agreed, simply because I was enamored with the fleeting tenderness I had seen at first. At that time, I was full of ambition, thinking that with sincerity and time, I could gradually win Franklin Maurice's heart. Later, I realized how ridiculous I was, foolishly coveting something that didn't even exist. Looking back now, I was just another Sean Wilcox, deluded and foolishly optimistic. I wasn't as brave as she was, able to repeatedly endure my husband's betrayal, but I was more clear-headed, not so crazy as to waste a lifetime on someone who didn't love me. Even though I still loved Franklin Maurice, and might never find someone who loved me more, I decided to give him up. Franklin Maurice's reaction was far beyond my expectations. He was passive and stubborn, refusing to say a word of plea or explanation. Yet his actions were unexpectedly harsh. He forbade me from saying the word divorce. If I dared to utter it, he would always find a hard-to-describe way to silence me. After being disciplined a few times, I kept quiet, and he started watching my every move, monitoring me openly and covertly. This was almost a different person from the indifferent Franklin Maurice of the past, and it was from then on that I began to sense something was wrong. Later, with no other options, I temporarily compromised, letting things be for now. After all, I wasn't losing out by eating and drinking on his dime. Seeing the reluctant female secretary leaving, I had an idea. Perhaps I could sincerely suggest a feasible solution. "I think that young lady is quite good. She has a nice appearance and figure, and looks smart. Her intelligence should be high as well." Franklin Maurice, who was taking off his coat and heading to the bedroom, stopped and turned to look at me. "So, she could perfectly fulfill the role of a wife. You think it's like choosing a president? Should I hold a voting election?" I clapped my hands. "Good idea. Line up all your mistresses, and let me and Mom take a look. If not, your employees can help advise as well. The more people, the better the outcome." Franklin Maurice was silent for a moment, seeming not to catch the sarcasm in my words, and just shook his head. "No need to bother. None of them will work." "Why? Anyway, you're only concerned with the business. Anyone can be a wife, right? If anyone can, why can't you?" I was speechless. Was it really that I couldn't? Or did he think I couldn't? But I didn't want to say that, as it seemed I was overly concerned. I could only choose the most objective and hurtful reason. "You know I can't bear children." My voice was as light as a feather. hoping it would avoid touching the deep-seated scar in my heart. Yet Franklin Maurice seemed as if pricked by a needle, suddenly trembling. He stood stunned for a moment, said nothing, and walked into the bedroom. Soon, the sound of running water came through, indicating he had gone to shower. Knowing he wouldn't be out soon, I slumped heavily onto the sofa, grabbing a pillow to cover my face, and letting myself sink into painful memories. My father was a truck driver, and my mother ran a small snack shop, a traditional, ordinary family, far from the artistic aristocracy of Franklin Maurice's family. Personally, I was diligent and hardworking, considered an independent and strong woman by others, but still couldn't measure up to the innate brilliance of someone like Franklin Maurice. Marrying Franklin Maurice had always felt like an unreal dream to me. He seemed almost flawless to outsiders, and I initially thought so too, but later realized that beneath such perfection was just an empty shell, lacking genuine warmth. Franklin Maurice had little emotion and interacted with people appropriately, but always felt like a robot with preset responses, flawless but insincere. The only time he showed clear joy was when he learned I was pregnant. He sang a song while washing all the clothes and kitchenware and even hugged me voluntarily. That was rare. He usually only hugged me in bed. I couldn't help but feel excited and grateful to the little life inside me, even starting to envision our happy future as a family of 3. When I was 2 months pregnant, Franklin Maurice's company developed a new project, and he was busy away from home for days at a time. I made his favorite dishes and went to the company to have lunch with him. Normally, we had a driver pick us up, but since the driver's daughter was taking her college entrance exams, I gave him 2 days off. By the time I remembered, I was already downstairs, and really missed Franklin Maurice, so I decided to drive myself. Unexpectedly, I was caught in a multi-vehicle accident on the road. The out-of-control vehicle pushed mine all the way into the green belt before stopping. The car was severely deformed, and the airbag deployed, trapping me tightly in the seat. I experienced intense abdominal pain, and a warm, sticky liquid trickled down my thigh, along with the fear and despair rising from my heart, gradually cooling my body. Time passed second by second. My consciousness started to fade, and the surrounding noise quieted down, leaving only my weak and futile cries. Franklin Maurice. When I woke up again, I was lying in a hospital bed, with the strong smell of disinfectant making my eyes sting and tear up. After the doctor regretfully informed me that the baby couldn't be saved, and my chances of getting pregnant again were very slim, I felt as if I had been thrown into an ice pit, my heart trembling with pain. I couldn't help but look at Franklin Maurice. He stood at the foot of the bed, staring blankly at me, his eyes somewhat hollow, lost in thought. He should be as sad as I was, since it was a new life he had once hoped for. Realizing this, I felt even more sorry and guilty. Overwhelmed by sorrow, I reached out, hoping Franklin Maurice would save me, even if just with a hug or a tear. But there was nothing. He simply said in a dry tone, "Don't be too sad. There will be more in the future." His tone was so flat, even the comfort didn't seem heartfelt, as if I were just a stranger in the next bed, and he was merely being polite out of courtesy. I closed my eyes tightly, tears silently falling, feeling regret for the first time. Countless moments of disappointment and sadness combined didn't compare to that one light comment, like a heavy blow that shattered all my hopes and perseverance. The next day, when Franklin Maurice came to bring me dinner, he suddenly took my hand, lowered his head, and warm tears fell onto my hand. 1 drop, 2 drops. He sat there in silence for a long time, his voice tinged with sadness. "Alice Francis, you've suffered." I silently looked out the window, feeling a numb, dull pain in my chest. Some things, when they come late, lose their meaning, and Franklin Maurice's responses always seem to be a beat too late. Just like now, he came out of the bathroom halfway through his shower, wrapped in a towel, walked over, and picked me up horizontally, heading toward the bedroom. "The doctor said it's a possibility, not absolute. Let's try to conceive. Even if it doesn't work, it's fine. I don't mind." Why did he suddenly get so enthusiastic? Was the shower water too hot? I panicked and pushed him away, my palm touching his hard, firm chest, and I couldn't help but blush. "Put me down. Find someone else to have a baby with. There is no one else. Also, you asked why they won't work. It's because I have a veto power." Alice Francis, My vote is only for you." It wasn't until Franklin Maurice threw me onto the bed and bounced me twice that I finally realized it wasn't the shower water that was the problem, it was Franklin Maurice, who had gone mad. In the end, we didn't end up making a baby. Franklin Maurice, unusually, just held me and slept through the night. It's hard to believe, but despite being married, we didn't share the same bed every night, and even when we did, there was rarely any hugging. He was always a disciplined and aloof person, disliking unnecessary emotional entanglements and excessive dependency. He found them useless. He always kept desires and feelings separate, hugging and kissing me one moment, then turning away and keeping a distance the next. I even suspected he had a split personality, just as he thought I had an imagination disorder. After one of my doubts, Franklin Maurice first showed helplessness. "Alice Francis, do you know how busy I am? I really don't have time for frivolous affairs. Don't underestimate yourself. With your intelligence and ability, perfect time management is not difficult." Franklin Maurice looked at me strangely. "I thought you were praising me, but I also feel like you're not sincere." I gritted my teeth. "It's really rare for your feelings to be correct." At that time, I had just had a miscarriage and was emotionally sensitive, always picking fights with Franklin Maurice. It wasn't really his fault. After all, the miscarriage wasn't his fault, but seeing him made me want to hurt him, resenting why I had to suffer while he could remain indifferent, continuing to go to work, eat, drink, and sleep, being the flirtatious man instead of a sorrowful father. This extreme contrast deeply affected me, and I could only provoke him repeatedly to regain some psychological balance. But in reality, I was testing Franklin Maurice's tolerance for me, driven by a strong sense of insecurity. After losing the baby and my fertility, I subconsciously believed I had lost Franklin Maurice as well. Surprisingly, Franklin Maurice actually accepted my endless nagging. He almost never argued with me or made excuses, mostly just responded with silence. At first, I thought this was his tolerance. It wasn't until one day when he asked if I wanted to travel to relax that I realized he saw me as a patient, and was magnanimously not engaging with me. He thought I had postpartum depression. Reflecting on it, Franklin Maurice's change seemed to start from that time. It was as if something had triggered him to shift some of his attention to me, even taking breaks from work to glance at me. But I didn't feel happy about it. I could tell that Franklin Maurice was struggling. It seemed like he was forcing himself to complete some predetermined task, as if he would have made a checklist and given himself a star for every item completed. Unfortunately, the stars would eventually run out, while human desires only grow stronger. Once I began to crave such attention from Franklin Maurice, it was bound to end in disappointment, just as it had before. No one can endure a second round of this, so I decided to get a divorce. Yet, when he questioned me, I couldn't even come up with a decent reason. That's the most frustrating thing about Franklin Maurice. He can be the most hurtful, but he hasn't actually done anything wrong. If he had done something with that woman earlier, I could have grabbed his hair, yelled at him, and given up. Instead, he's holding me tightly in his arms, making me feel stifled and unable to move. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, and I kicked him. Franklin Maurice grabbed my ankle and began rubbing it with his hand. His hands were large, with a slight runniness, which made it a bit itchy. I tried to pull away, but he held on tighter. Feeling his increasingly heavy breathing, I dared not move, but a sense of absurd resignation bubbled up inside me. Franklin Maurice seemed oblivious to the idea of divorce or was deliberately ignoring my wishes, continuing to act as he pleased. Yet his actions were increasingly unusual. For one, he had become more physically affectionate, perhaps trying to prove or hold on to something. I slowly opened my eyes and met Franklin Maurice's deep, focused gaze. He was looking at me, though I couldn't tell for how long. Perhaps darkness hides the deepest vulnerabilities, and gives me a courage I don't have in daylight. "Why won't you agree to the divorce? You clearly weren't too happy about getting married in the first place." Franklin Maurice blinked slowly and, after some contemplation, answered, "It wasn't so much about unhappiness, but rather I didn't see the need. Before that, I thought emotions were the least necessary thing. I never had them and lived just fine." I pursed my lips, thinking to myself that he lived like a soulless machine, never knowing what true happiness was. "Well, I'm giving you the chance to get out of this marriage and return to your previous life. Not now. You probably can't live independently at the moment, Franklin Maurice said, pulling me even closer. I was momentarily taken aback, realizing he still thought I was unwell. Yet he never mentioned taking me to see a psychologist, perhaps fearing it would upset me more. But he couldn't let me leave, so he clung to me, seemingly intending to help me heal himself. It was a bit amusing, but my chest was filled with a warm, tingling feeling. Maybe Franklin Maurice wasn't entirely bad. Perhaps my heart wasn't entirely wasted. Well, thank you then, for thinking of me. Franklin Maurice thought for a moment and mumbled softly, actually, it's not entirely. I seemed to have a bit of reluctance myself. His few words were like a thunderclap on my head. I instinctively tightened my grip on the bedsheet, and a layer of sweat broke out on my back. Reluctance. This was the first time I heard a word related to emotions from Franklin Maurice, and it was quite surprising. His hesitant and unfamiliar tone made this otherwise ordinary feeling seem especially precious. I tentatively asked him, "How did you come to realize this?" "One morning, while I was brushing my teeth, I saw your toothbrush next to my cup and remembered how you used to squeeze the toothpaste for me. I thought I'd really miss that if you weren't here. It might disrupt my morning routine, causing me to be late and affecting my entire day's work and mood." I couldn't hold back and pinched him. "So, it's not that you're reluctant to lose your wife but rather you're free made. Heh. I also want to hold you while I sleep. You're so warm and soft, and I still want to share a bed with you." I covered his mouth. Enough. I couldn't stand him saying flirtatious things seriously, it was too damn tempting. After a while, as I was about to drift off, Franklin Maurice suddenly asked, "Alice Francis, do you want to go back to work?" I knew he wanted me to return to a familiar environment, to interact with others and gradually regain some confidence and independence through work achievements. I didn't immediately agree, just said I needed to think about it. I might end up finding a new job, because I still hadn't given up on the idea of divorce. Franklin Maurice seemed to understand my thoughts, and didn't push further. He just started coming home earlier from work each day, as if to keep an eye on me, and be the first to hear my decision. For several days, he brought his work home, handling it in the study without closing the door, occasionally glancing up at me as I walked around the living room. It was such a strange feeling, reminiscent of a high school teacher peeking through the back window. It was a shadow over my life. Eventually, I couldn't hold back any longer. I made a few dishes and took them to his office for lunch, letting him know that I had decided to go back to work. The elevator password hadn't changed, so I went straight to the 35th floor. When Lennon House, the assistant, saw me, he greeted me with surprise. Just as we were talking, the door to Franklin Maurice's office opened, and a young woman with an ordinary appearance and quick wit walked out. I didn't recognize her. Lennon House introduced her. "This is Franklin Maurice's new chief secretary, a returnee." "What about the previous one?" I asked, referring to the woman with the curvy waist. "Oh, she was fired a while ago." Not sure why. Maybe she made a mistake or something. According to Lennon House's timeline, this was the day after I saw Franklin Maurice bringing her home for documents. I was puzzled but didn't ask further. I took the food box into Franklin Maurice's office. He was sitting on the sofa, taking medication. His stomach must have been hurting again. "What time is it? If I hadn't come, would you have skipped lunch again? No wonder your stomach issues persist, you're only hurting yourself." The new secretary doesn't know my tastes, so I didn't have her order food. I was going to go down to the company cafeteria later. But here you are, my little snail. Franklin Maurice seemed in good spirits as he picked up his chopsticks. His eating manners were refined. He rarely made noise and occasionally praised me, his face showing clear satisfaction. "Why did you fire the previous secretary? She seemed dedicated and efficient when I saw her." "She had some issues. She kept leaning on me, which made me uncomfortable." I clicked my tongue. "She liked you and was trying to be friendly. Even if you didn't accept it, you didn't have to fire her. Maybe just transfer her to another position. I thought it would make you happier." Again, there was that hesitation and uncertainty in Franklin Maurice's voice, which was rare in his life. I knew what it meant. My heart felt like it was being immersed in hot water, beating with excitement and warmth. Each beat seemed to say, "I'm happy," but I remained indifferent on the surface, and decided to keep my decision to myself for now. As the days went by, Franklin Maurice became increasingly anxious as I didn't agree. He suggested taking me abroad for a trip to make up for our missed honeymoon. It was clear to me that he didn't want me idle, fearing I might start another divorce drama, or worsen my condition with idle thoughts. I never expected that one day I would become more important than his work. Since it was a free trip, I chose the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, a famous diving destination with dreamlike underwater scenes. Most importantly, there was a beautiful church on Heart Reef, a place I had sworn to visit in my lifetime, to hold hands with my loved one, and vow our love in the distant southern hemisphere. Franklin Maurice didn't understand this. He only asked if I had a diving license. He truly was the least romantic person ever. The day we arrived at the Great Barrier Reef, the weather was perfect. I changed into my swimsuit, applied sunscreen, and excitedly ran to the beach. Franklin Maurice followed me with a surfboard, his gaze fixed on me, which actually looked quite affectionate. From the azure waters, I looked at him. He was still the same cold, stiff person, but something had clearly changed. He was even jealous. A blonde, blue-eyed man approached me. I responded casually, glancing at Franklin Maurice, who was sitting on the beach, staring at us while playing with the sand unconsciously, showing no reaction. When the man put his arm around my waist and invited me for a drink, Franklin Maurice finally got up and walked over. His steps hurried and his face not looking good. He said awkwardly in English, "This is my wife." The man shrugged and apologized. I smiled slightly, and Franklin Maurice, holding the back of my neck, turned my head and kissed me on the lips. To be honest, it felt like a big dog claiming its bone. I wiped my mouth and said, "Don't say that in the future. I might not be your wife anymore, so don't interfere with my chance to find a new partner." "You are. Why should your word be final? What are you going to use to keep me?" Franklin Maurice's face darkened further, and he didn't know how to respond. He always struggled to win arguments with me and could only frown and kiss me again. With my eyes closed, I felt his hot breath and urgent lips, as if I could touch his shrinking heart through his stiff exterior, so tangled and crumpled. Even he couldn't smooth it out. Yet I wanted to give it a try. For this reason, I decided to take a chance. When diving, I didn't immediately go to the deep sea, but stayed in the shallow layers. I removed my oxygen equipment and held my breath, trying to sink slowly. The cold sea water surged from all sides, pressing against me fiercely. I opened my eyes behind the diving mask, and saw colorful little fish swimming between my fingers, surrounded by endless tranquility. In this fairy-tale-like scene, I remembered a meeting with Sean Wilcox a few months ago. I had sought her out when I noticed Franklin Maurice's extreme reaction to divorce. She had looked surprised and sighed, revealing something I never knew about Franklin Maurice. He suffered from emotional bluntness without realizing it. Having seen the chaotic and troubled arguments of his parents growing up, Franklin Maurice had developed a rejection of so-called emotions and close relationships. He found them troublesome, dirty, and degrading. He felt fear and even disgust, subconsciously blocking out any emotional triggers and stimuli, trying not to focus or respond. Over time, he became numb and insensitive to emotions from others and himself. This explained why I always misunderstood him as accepting advances from other women. He simply didn't realize they liked him. Similarly, he didn't know I liked him, nor did he realize he liked me. Yes, Sean Wilcox said he liked me, which seemed a bit laughable, as he even needed his mother to confess on his behalf. Franklin Maurice had a white cat when he was around 10. It was very cute, and every day after school, he would personally clean its paws, washing each hair thoroughly before playing with it for a long time. He loved soft things. Later, the kitten ran outside and was run over by a car. Franklin Maurice must have been very sad, but he couldn't feel it himself. He silently buried the cat in the yard. It wasn't until a rainy night 3 days later that I saw him crouching in the rain, staring at the mound of dirt where he buried the cat, that I realized something was wrong. I consulted a psychologist and learned about this condition. He doesn't completely lack the ability to feel emotions. He's just slower to react and think compared to others. His responses are often indifferent. There's no good treatment, but if severe, it can develop into depression. I've tried to guide him over the years, but I was afraid of making it too obvious in case he realized something was wrong. The results have been minimal. Over time, he has adapted, and it hasn't hindered him from becoming an excellent person, so I stopped pushing. When he first saw you, the way he wiped your face with a handkerchief reminded me of how he used to clean his cat's paws. I knew he was interested in you, so I tried to bring you together. He does like you, though he doesn't know it yet. Alice Francis, please give him time. I listened to Sean Wilcox's words, tears streaming down my face as I remembered countless moments of Franklin Morris's stiff, unfeeling demeanor. In those moments of despair and helplessness, where even a reluctance to divorce only led to awkward confrontations, everything about him hurt me deeply. I didn't want to escape. I just wanted to embrace him even more tightly. So, I consulted a psychologist and implemented a series of gradual stimuli to increase his emotional perception and response speed. First, I insisted on the divorce, clearly sensing his shock, followed by reluctance. Then, I deliberately misunderstood him as cheating, trying to provoke his grievances and anger. As expected, he went from indifferent to explaining a little. He began to show reluctance, caring about my feelings, worrying about me when he thought I was ill, feeling jealous, and stubbornly possessive. Franklin Maurice began to improve bit by bit because of me. I was secretly pleased but couldn't help but worry about what if he couldn't fully recover. Just as I thought this, someone grabbed my right hand, and the next moment, a new respirator was placed on my face. Franklin Maurice held me tightly, and quickly swam us to the surface. I looked at him in a daze, and as we emerged, I reached out to hold his neck. In the line between life and death, I embraced the person I love with my renewed self. Franklin Maurice placed me on the ground and calmly checked my condition. Aside from being a bit pale, he looked much like usual, only his slightly trembling fingertips revealed his anxiety. After confirming I was safe, he sighed in relief, gazing at me with eyes as deep as ink, which seemed to contain a hint of sadness. Franklin Maurice was upset, and I had started to understand him. Alice Francis, don't be like this. I can stay with you until you get better. If you still want a divorce, then I'll agree. Don't be unhappy. Although happiness is really hard, you were so happy before, and you can be again. His voice was low, but surprisingly smooth, as if these words had been repeated in his mind 1,000 times. It took me a moment to realize what he meant. Franklin Maurice probably thought I was trying to commit suicide, but he still wanted to keep me, even agreeing to divorce as a trade. Even though he was unwilling, I was both amused and helpless, feeling as if seawater had flowed into my mouth and nose, salty and bitter, followed by a burning flame rising from deep within. Regarding the interruption earlier, I now had an answer. I would continue to pretend to be ill, to stay by his side, making him feel needed, letting him take care of me, and making him believe that he healed me. He would experience the power of love firsthand, and perhaps he would be willing to unlock the shackles on his heart, and he would never discover his own illness. He would only get better with time and companionship, and even if he couldn't fully recover, it wouldn't matter because I would always be by his side, because I finally understood. We are in love. The story ends here. Feel free to subscribe to the channel for the latest updates, with numerous novels updated daily.